The barn was already burning when Jonah Cross reached the ridge. Orange flames clawed at the New Mexico sky, and through the smoke, he could see her, Mara Hale, dragging her screaming daughter toward the well while embers rained down like hellfire. The town had called her plain, forgettable, a woman who'd never mattered to anyone. But as Jonah kicked his horse into a dead run, ash stinging his eyes and fear hammering in his chest, he knew one truth with sudden, terrible clarity. If he lost her now, before he'd ever truly seen her, he'd spend the rest of his life mourning a chance he'd been too afraid to take. Before we begin this story of courage, second chances, and love that refuses to hide, please hit that like button and comment below with your city or country so I can see how far Mara and Jonah's journey travels across this world. Now, let's go back to where it all started. 3 weeks earlier, the prairie had been quiet. Mara Hale stood in her garden as the sun climbed over the eastern hills, her hands already dirt-stained from pulling weeds between the potato rows. The soil here was stubborn, clay-thick in some places, sandy and loose in others, but she'd learned its moods over the 4 years since she'd claimed this land. Learned when to push and when to wait. Learned that survival on the edge of Lincoln County, New Mexico territory, meant accepting that beauty was a luxury and comfort was something other women got. She straightened, pressing one mud-caked hand to the small of her back, and looked toward the cabin. 20 feet away, on the shallow porch, 4-year-old Ellie sat cross-legged with her wooden animals arranged in careful rows. The child's dark hair hung loose around her face, and her lips moved silently as she narrated some story only she could hear. "Ellie, stay where I can see you," Mara called. The girl looked up, nodded once, then returned to her game. She was a quiet child, had been since birth, but her silence wasn't empty. Ellie noticed everything, remembered everything. Sometimes Mara wondered if that sharp little mind was a blessing or a burden in a world that didn't reward women for seeing too clearly. The sun climbed higher. Mara worked until her shoulders ached and her fingers cramped around the hoe handle. Then she hauled 2 buckets of water from the well and poured them over the thirstiest plants. The land drank it down without gratitude. Everything out here took and took, the wind, the sun, the hard-packed earth. Even the town, 5 miles south, seemed to drain something from her every time she rode in for supplies. She didn't go often. By midday, the heat was brutal. Mara retreated to the cabin's thin shade and sat beside Ellie, who immediately leaned against her side. The child's small body was warm and solid, and Mara wrapped an arm around her, pressing her nose briefly to the top of Ellie's head. Dust and sunshine and something sweet, that's what her daughter smelled like. That's what kept Mara moving through days that might otherwise have felt like drowning. "Hungry?" Mara asked. Ellie nodded. They ate cornbread and beans in companionable silence. Then Ellie returned to her animals while Mara mended a torn apron. The afternoon stretched long and still, broken only by the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead and the whisper of wind through the scrub grass. It was near sunset when the rider appeared. Mara saw him first as a dark shape on the horizon, moving slowly along the rutted track that passed for a road. She stood, one hand shading her eyes, and watched him approach. Out here, visitors were rare and rarely welcome. Men traveling alone could mean trouble, especially for a woman on her own with a child. She stepped to the edge of the porch and waited. Behind her, Ellie had gone still, watching through the gap between the porch rails. The rider came closer, and details emerged. A big man on a bigger horse, broad-shouldered, sitting easy in the saddle despite his size. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, and dust covered him from boots to collar. When he was close enough to speak without shouting, he slowed his horse to a walk, then stopped a respectful distance from the cabin. "Ma'am?" His voice was deep, roughened by sun and wind. "Forgive the intrusion." Mara studied him. His face was weathered, sun-dark, with lines carved around his eyes and mouth that spoke of years spent squinting into bright skies. He was older than her, 40, maybe, or near enough, and enormous. Even sitting, he seemed to tower, his shoulders blocking out the horizon behind him. "You lost?" she asked. "Might be." He shifted in the saddle and the leather creaked. "Looking for the Cross Ranch. Man in town said it was west of here, but I've been riding near 2 hours and haven't seen it." Mara almost smiled. You passed it, about 3 miles back. There's a fork in the road. You want the northern branch, not the southern. Gates marked with a burned brand on the post. The man sat very still for a moment, then nodded slowly. That'd be my own gate, then. Should have noticed it. She blinked. You're Jonah Cross? I am. Mara had heard the name. Everyone in the county had. Cross owned more land than any 3 ranchers combined, ran cattle and horses both, employed half a dozen men year-round. People spoke of him the way they spoke of the mountains, permanent, distant, untouchable. She'd never heard anyone speak of him warmly, but neither had she heard cruelty attached to his name. He existed in a space beyond the town's usual judgments, too wealthy and too removed to be subjected to the same gossip that followed smaller lives. You're a long way from your own land, Mr. Cross, she said. Jonah, he corrected. And yes, ma'am, I am. Got turned around coming back from Santa Fe. Should have paid better attention. He paused, then added, appreciate the directions. He gathered his reins, preparing to leave. But before he could turn the horse, Ellie's voice piped up from behind Mara. You're really big. Mara's heart jumped into her throat. Ellie. But Jonah had already looked down at the child, and something shifted in his expression. Not irritation, not amusement exactly. Something softer, almost surprised. I suppose I am, he said gravely. Are you really small, or is it just me? Ellie considered this with absolute seriousness. Maybe both. This time Jonah did smile, a brief, faint thing that changed his whole face. He looked, for a moment, like a different man entirely. Younger, less carved from stone. Could be you're right, he said. Mara's hand found Ellie's shoulder and squeezed gently. The child leaned back against her legs, content now that her observation had been acknowledged. Jonah settled his hat more firmly. I'll leave you to your evening. Thank you again, Mrs. Hale, Mara said. Mara Hale. It's Miss, not Mrs. She said it plainly, without shame or explanation, because she'd learned years ago that clarifying her unmarried status up front saved trouble later. Some men heard Miss and saw an invitation. Others heard it and saw a warning. She couldn't control which, but she could be clear. Jonah nodded once. Miss Hale. Then, with another glance at Ellie, he turned his horse and rode north, back the way he'd come. Mara watched until he disappeared over the rise, then let out a long breath. That was the biggest man I ever saw, Ellie said wonderingly. Yes, Mara agreed. Yes, he was. She didn't think much more about it. Men like Jonah Cross didn't ride into her life and stay. They passed through, noted her existence the way they might note a fence post or a mile marker, and moved on. That was how the world worked for women like her. Plain, poor, burdened with a fatherless child and dirt under her fingernails. Visible only when useful, forgettable the moment the need passed. But 3 days later, Jonah Cross returned. It was mid-morning, and Mara was hauling firewood from the small lean-to beside the cabin when she heard hoofbeats. She straightened, shading her eyes, and saw him coming up the track. Same horse, same dust-covered coat, but this time he was carrying something in a canvas bag slung over his saddle. He stopped at the same respectful distance as before and dismounted, moving with the careful deliberation of a large man conscious of his own size. Miss Hale. Mr. Cross? Jonah, he reminded her. She nodded but didn't repeat it. Calling him by his first name felt too familiar, like claiming a friendship that didn't exist. He reached into the bag and pulled out a small burlap sack. Brought you something. Hope it's not unwelcome. Mara approached slowly, and he held the sack out. She took it, felt the weight, the shape, and opened it to find apples. 6 of them, red and firm, not a bruise among them. Her throat tightened. Apples were expensive this far from anywhere, and these were good ones. The kind you didn't see at the general store. Why? She asked. Jonah looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Seemed like you might appreciate them. Ellie, too. As if summoned by her name, Ellie appeared in the cabin doorway, still holding one of her wooden animals. She stared at Jonah with wide, solemn eyes. Hello, Jonah said. Hello, Ellie whispered. Mara glanced between them, then back at the apples. She should refuse. Accepting gifts from men she barely knew was dangerous. It created obligations, expectations. But Ellie hadn't tasted fresh fruit in months, and Mara's pride wasn't worth denying her daughter that small joy. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That's kind." Jonah nodded, then cleared his throat. "Wonder if I could ask something in return." There it was, the expectation. Mara's spine stiffened, and she held the sack a little tighter. "What?" "A pie," he said. "If you're willing. I haven't had a decent pie in 3 years, and a man in town said you make good ones. I'd pay, of course." Mara stared at him. Of all the things she'd braced herself to hear, that hadn't been among them. "You rode all the way out here to ask for a pie?" Seemed simpler than sending a letter. She almost laughed. Might have, if she'd remembered how. "Apple?" she asked, lifting the sack slightly. "If it's not too much trouble." It would be trouble. Everything was trouble. But it was manageable trouble. Honest trouble. She could make a pie. She could do that much. 2 days, she said. "Come back in 2 days, late afternoon. I'll have it ready." Jonah's shoulders relaxed, just slightly. "I'm grateful, Miss Hale." He mounted his horse with surprising grace for such a large man, then paused, looking down at her. For a moment, she thought he might say something else, but he only touched the brim of his hat and rode away. Ellie came to stand beside Mara, slipping her small hand into her mother's. "Can I have an apple now?" she asked. Mara looked down at her daughter's hopeful face and felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been closed for a very long time. "Yes," she said. "Yes, you can." They went inside together, and Mara cut one of the apples into careful slices. Ellie ate them slowly, reverently, juice running down her chin, and Mara watched her and tried not to think about how one small kindness could undo so much careful numbness. 2 days later, the pie was ready. Mara had risen before dawn to bake it, using the last of her good flour and precious butter she'd been saving for winter. She'd made the crust from memory, her mother's recipe, passed down from a grandmother Mara had never met, and filled it with the apples Jonah had brought, sweetened with honey and cinnamon. The cabin had smelled like comfort while it baked, and Ellie had sat at the table with her chin in her hands, breathing in the scent with her eyes closed. By late afternoon, the pie sat cooling on the windowsill, golden and perfect. Mara had changed into her least worn dress and rebraided her hair, though she told herself it was only because she didn't want to look like she'd just crawled out of the garden. It had nothing to do with wanting to appear less plain, less forgettable. Jonah arrived exactly when he'd said he would. This time, when he dismounted, Ellie came down off the porch without being called. She walked right up to him, bold in the way only small children could be, and looked up and up and up. "Did you bring more apples?" she asked. "Ellie," Mara said sharply. But Jonah was already crouching down, bringing himself closer to Ellie's level. Though even crouched, he was still enormous. "Not this time," he said. "But maybe next time, if your mama says it's all right." Ellie looked back at Mara, a question in her dark eyes. Mara's heart was beating too fast. She didn't know what to do with this man who crouched in the dust to speak gently to her daughter, who asked for pies instead of other things, who'd ridden 6 miles twice now for no reason she could understand. "We'll see," she managed. Jonah rose and nodded, accepting the uncertainty. Mara went inside and brought out the pie, wrapped carefully in a clean cloth. When she handed it to him, their fingers brushed, brief, accidental, and she felt the warmth of his skin through the fabric. "How much do I owe you?" he asked. She'd thought about this. A pie like this, in town, would cost 50 cents, maybe more. But she'd used his apples, and naming a price felt wrong somehow, like reducing something fragile to a transaction. "The apples were payment enough," she said. Jonah frowned. "That's not fair to you." "It's fair enough." They stood there in the golden afternoon light, the pie between them, neither quite willing to let the moment end. Finally, Jonah shifted the pie to one arm and reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a silver dollar and held it out. "For your trouble," he said. Mara looked at the coin, then at his face. There was no arrogance in his expression, no expectation, only a quiet respect that made her chest ache. She took the dollar. "Thank you." "Thank you, Miss Hale." He glanced down at Ellie, who was watching him with unblinking attention. And thank you, Miss Ellie, for sharing your mama. Ellie grinned, sudden and bright, like the sun breaking through clouds. You're welcome, Mr. Big. Jonah blinked. Then, incredibly, he laughed, a low, rusty sound, as if he hadn't used it in a long time. Mr. Big, he repeated. That's a new one. He rode away, still smiling, and Mara stood on the porch with her daughter and a silver dollar and the strange, dangerous feeling that something had just shifted beneath her feet. Over the following weeks, Jonah came back. Not every day, not predictably, but regularly enough that Ellie started listening for hoofbeats in the afternoons, and Mara stopped being surprised when she looked up from her work to see him riding in. He always brought something, never too much, never too personal. Apples again. Fresh eggs from his hens. Once, a small bag of sugar. And he always asked for something in return. Bread, preserves, mending. Small, manageable trades that let them both pretend there was logic to his visits. But logic didn't explain the way he listened when Mara talked about her garden, nodding as if her struggles with clay soil and late frosts mattered. Logic didn't explain the way he sat on the porch rail, carefully, because it creaked under his weight, and watched Ellie draw pictures in the dust with a stick, asking her questions about the animals she drew and the stories she told. That's a horse, Ellie explained one afternoon, pointing at a lopsided four-legged shape. And that's a cow. And that's a dragon. Don't see many dragons in New Mexico, Jonah observed. This one lives in the mountains, Ellie said seriously. He's lonely. Jonah looked at the drawing for a long moment. That's so. Yes, he wants a friend, but everyone's scared of him because he's big. Mara, shelling peas on the porch, went very still. She didn't look up, didn't let herself see if Jonah had noticed the way Ellie's story wasn't really about dragons at all. But his voice, when he spoke again, was gentler. Maybe the dragon just needs to find the right friend. Someone who's not scared. Maybe, Ellie agreed. Then she looked up at him, squinting against the sun. Are you lonely? Ellie, Mara said quickly, that's not... It's all right, Jonah interrupted. He was quiet for a long moment, watching the child with an expression Mara couldn't read. Yeah, he said finally. Sometimes I am. Ellie nodded as if he'd just confirmed something she'd already known. Then she went back to her drawing, adding another shape. This one smaller, standing beside the dragon. That's the friend, she explained. Now he's not lonely anymore. Jonah stared at the drawing. Then he looked at Mara, and the weight of his gaze made her breath catch. She looked away first, fingers fumbling with the peas. This was dangerous. She'd known that from the start, but she told herself it was manageable. Just a man who liked her cooking. Just a lonely rancher who appreciated conversation. Nothing more. But the truth was heavier than that, and getting heavier every time he rode in. The truth was that she'd started listening for him. Started thinking about what she might say when he arrived. Started noticing the way her heart lifted when she saw him on the horizon. Started feeling, for the first time in years, like something other than a burden to be endured. And that was the most dangerous thing of all, because Mara knew what she was. Plain, poor, unremarkable. A woman with a fatherless child and dirt under her fingernails, living on the edge of land nobody wanted. She was useful, maybe. Capable, but not chosen. Not wanted for herself. Men like Jonah Cross didn't choose women like her. Not openly. Not in daylight. Not in ways that lasted. But when he looked at her, really looked, like he was seeing something that mattered, she forgot to remember that. She forgot to protect herself. And that forgetting would cost her. She was sure of it. The town noticed before she did. Mara rode into Lincoln on a Saturday morning to buy flour and salt. Ellie perched behind her on the mule. The general store was busy. Farmers and ranchers stocking up before the weather turned, and she waited her turn patiently, Ellie's small hand gripping the back of her skirt. She was at the counter, counting out coins, when she heard it. Saw him riding out there again yesterday, a woman's voice said, pitched just loud enough to carry. Third time this week. Another voice, equally public. Wonder what he finds so interesting on that scrub land. Can't be the view. Laughter. Pointed. Sharp. Mara's hand stilled on the coins. Behind her, Ellie had gone quiet, pressed against her leg. Maybe he's charitable, the first woman continued. Feels sorry for her. Charity doesn't usually involve that many visits. More laughter. Mara's face burned. She finished counting, pushed the coins across the counter, and took her supplies without looking at the shopkeeper. She could feel eyes on her, curious, amused, judging, as she turned and walked toward the door. "Morning, Miss Hale," someone said. Too cheerful, too loud. She didn't respond. Just kept walking, Ellie hurrying to keep up. They were outside, loading the supplies onto the mule, when a man's voice stopped her. "Mara." She turned. Joseph Trent stood a few feet away, hat in his hands. He was younger than her, probably 25, and he'd asked her to dance twice at the last town gathering. She'd refused both times, politely but firmly. "Joseph!" "Heard some talk in there." He jerked his chin toward the store. "Don't pay it any mind. People got nothing better to do than gossip." Mara tied the supply bag with stiff fingers. "I appreciate that." "Still." Joseph stepped closer, voice dropping. "Might be wise to keep your distance from Cross. For your own sake. People talk, and once they start, it's hard to stop them." She looked at him then, really looked. He seemed sincere, concerned even. And maybe he was, but his concern didn't change the fact that he, like everyone else, assumed she needed warning, assumed she didn't know her place, assumed that a man like Jonah Cross couldn't possibly want a woman like her for any reason that mattered. "I'll keep that in mind," she said evenly. Joseph nodded, satisfied that he'd done his duty. He tipped his hat to Ellie, who stared back, unblinking, and walked away. Mara mounted the mule, pulled Ellie up behind her, and rode home. She didn't cry, didn't let herself feel the hot shame that pressed against the back of her throat. She just rode, and when they got home, she unloaded the supplies in silence and went back to work. But that night, after Ellie was asleep, Mara sat on the porch in the dark and let herself think about what would happen if Jonah stopped coming. It shouldn't matter. She'd survived before he'd ridden into her life, and she'd survive after. The garden would still need tending. Ellie would still need feeding. The world would keep turning, indifferent to whether Mara Hale was lonely or content, or something jagged and uncertain in between. But it would matter. That was the truth she'd been avoiding. It would matter more than she wanted it to, more than was safe. And if he did stop coming, or worse, if he kept coming but with the careful distance of someone who'd heard talk and decided it wasn't worth the trouble, she didn't know if she could bear it without breaking. So when hoofbeats came the next afternoon, Mara's heart jumped and sank in the same breath. She stood from the garden, brushing dirt from her hands, and watched Jonah approach. He looked the same as always, steady, solid, dust-covered. But when he dismounted, she thought she saw something different in his face. A tension around his eyes, a weight in the way he moved. "Afternoon, Miss Hale." "Jonah?" His name felt dangerous in her mouth. Too familiar. Too much like hope. Ellie came running from the cabin, but Mara caught her shoulder gently. "Stay here a minute, sweetheart." Ellie frowned but obeyed, sensing something in her mother's tone. Jonah glanced at the child, then back at Mara. "Everything all right?" "Should it be?" He was quiet for a moment, then, "Heard there was talk in town yesterday. About me visiting." Of course he'd heard. Everyone heard everything eventually. "Yes," Mara said simply. "That bother you?" The question surprised her. She'd expected, what? An apology, maybe, or distance, but not this direct, quiet asking, as if her answer mattered. "Does it bother you?" she countered. Jonah looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression, something that made her chest tight. "No," he said. "It doesn't." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning she didn't dare examine too closely. "Then, no," Mara said quietly. "It doesn't bother me either." Jonah nodded slowly. Then he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small cloth-wrapped bundle. "Brought you something." Mara took it, unfolding the cloth to find a bar of good soap. Not the harsh lye soap she made herself, but something finer, scented faintly with lavender. Her throat closed. It was such a small thing, such a personal thing. "Jonah, for Ellie," he said quickly. "Thought she might like it." They both knew he was lying, The soap wasn't for Ellie, but the lie gave them both room to pretend, to step back from the edge of something neither was ready to name. "Thank you," Mara said. Ellie, who'd been watching with barely contained patience, finally broke free and ran to Jonah. "Can I show you something?" "Of course." The child grabbed his hand, her small fingers disappearing into his large palm, and tugged him toward the fence, chattering about a bird's nest she'd found. Jonah let himself be led, listening with the same grave attention he always gave her, and Mara watched them and felt something crack wider in her chest. This was what breaking felt like, she thought. This slow fracturing, this careful coming apart. Not dramatic or sudden, but gradual. A wall dismantled stone by stone until you looked up one day and realized you were standing undefended in the open air. And the most terrifying part was that she didn't want to stop it. So she didn't. She let Jonah stay until the sun started to sink, let Ellie climb the fence rail to be closer to his height, let herself sit beside him on the porch while Ellie played, and let the silence between them feel like something other than emptiness. And when he finally rode away, she stood watching until he disappeared over the horizon, and she didn't tell herself it was the last time, because she knew it wouldn't be. The breaking had already begun. The weeks that followed moved like water finding its course, inevitable, quiet, changing the landscape without announcement. Jonah came 3 times a week now, sometimes 4. He'd given up pretending there were errands that brought him out this far, trades that necessitated the ride. He simply came, arriving in the late afternoons when the work was heaviest, and he helped. Not with words or grand gestures, but with his hands. He mended the sagging fence line without being asked, reinforced the chicken coop against coyotes, split enough firewood to last through winter, his axe rising and falling with a rhythm that became as familiar as Ellie's laughter. Mara stopped protesting after the first few times, stopped insisting she could manage on her own, stopped offering payment he wouldn't accept. She simply let him work, and she worked beside him, and in the comfortable silence between them, something grew that had no name but felt more solid than words could make it. Ellie followed Jonah everywhere, a small shadow to his large one. She talked to him the way she talked to her wooden animals, constant, rambling, unburdened by self-consciousness. She told him about the clouds that looked like rabbits, about the spider living in the corner of the porch, about her dreams where she could fly. And Jonah listened to all of it with the same grave attention, as if every word mattered. One afternoon, he arrived with something wrapped in oilcloth tied to his saddle. Ellie spotted it immediately. "What's that?" she asked, bouncing on her toes. Jonah dismounted and carefully unwrapped the bundle. Inside was a wooden horse carved with surprising delicacy, its mane detailed in careful strokes, legs positioned mid-gallop. It was beautiful, too beautiful to be a toy. "Made it for you," he said, crouching to offer it to Ellie. "If you want it." Ellie's eyes went wide. She reached out slowly, reverently, and took the horse in both hands. "You made this?" "I did." "For me?" "For you." Ellie looked up at her mother, seeking permission, and Mara felt her throat close. She nodded, unable to speak, and Ellie turned back to Jonah with the kind of joy that was too big for a small body to contain. "Thank you, Mr. Big," she whispered, then threw her arms around his neck. Jonah went very still. For a moment he didn't move at all, and Mara wondered if she should pull Ellie back, apologize for the presumption. But then his large hand came up, settling gently on the child's back, and he closed his eyes briefly, something like pain crossing his face. "You're welcome, little one," he said quietly. When Ellie finally let go and ran off to show the horse to her other wooden animals, Jonah stood slowly, not quite meeting Mara's eyes. "That was kind of you," she said. "She needed something nice." He cleared his throat. "Kids should have nice things." "Most people wouldn't think so, not for a child like her." The words came out harder than she'd intended, edged with years of watching people look at her daughter and find her wanting, too quiet, too strange, too burdened by a mother who couldn't give her a proper life. Jonah's jaw tightened. "Most people are fools." The conviction in his voice startled her. He wasn't being polite or kind. He was angry, quietly, deeply angry, on Ellie's behalf. "She's lucky to have you," Mara said softly. Jonah finally looked at her then, and the weight of his gaze made her breath catch. "I'm not the one doing the lucky having." Before she could respond, before she could even process what he'd meant, He turned and walked toward the woodpile, and the moment closed like a door. But Mara stood there, heart hammering, and felt the ground shift beneath her feet again. The first frost came early that year, crackling across the prairie overnight and leaving the grass silver in the dawn light. Mara woke to find ice in the water bucket and Ellie's breath misting in the cabin's cold air. She built up the fire, wrapped Ellie in an extra blanket, and went outside to assess the damage to her garden. Most of the late vegetables were gone, blackened and limp, already losing their shape. She'd harvested what she could before the freeze, but there hadn't been enough warning, and now she stared at the ruined plants and calculated what it would cost her through the winter. Less variety, smaller portions. Maybe a trip to town she couldn't afford to buy what she should have grown herself. She was still standing there, hands numb with cold, when Jonah arrived. He took one look at the garden, then at her face, and dismounted without a word. He walked to where she stood and studied the frozen plants, his expression unreadable. "Lost much?" he asked. "Enough." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I've got vegetables stored, more than I need. I'll bring some by." "Jonah, not charity," he said firmly. "Trade. You fed me half a dozen times. This evens it out." It didn't, and they both knew it. But Mara was tired of pride, tired of refusing help she desperately needed, tired of pretending she didn't want to lean on someone for once in her life. "All right," she said quietly. "Thank you." Jonah nodded, then glanced toward the cabin. "Ellie inside?" "Yes, keeping warm." "Good." He hesitated, then added, "Could use some coffee if you've got it. Cold right out here." It was a transparent excuse to come inside, to extend the visit, but Mara didn't call him on it. She just led the way to the cabin, and when she opened the door, warmth and the smell of wood smoke spilled out. Ellie looked up from where she was playing with her wooden animals, the carved horse now the centerpiece of whatever story she was telling, and her face lit up. "Jonah!" She scrambled to her feet and ran to him. "Look what the horse is doing!" Over coffee and Ellie's rambling narration, the morning passed. Jonah sat at Mara's small table, too large for the chair, his shoulders nearly touching the walls, and listened to a 4-year-old explain in elaborate detail why the horse and the cow were friends. But the chicken was suspicious of both of them. Mara moved around the cabin, mending clothes and trying not to stare at the way he fit into this small space, the way his presence made the room feel fuller but not crowded, safer but not confined. Eventually, Ellie wore herself out and curled up on the bed with the carved horse clutched to her chest, falling asleep mid-sentence. Mara covered her with a blanket, then returned to the table where Jonah still sat, cradling his empty coffee cup in both hands. "She's a good kid," he said quietly. "Yes." "Doesn't seem lonely to me." Mara glanced at her sleeping daughter. "She has me." "That's enough?" The question wasn't accusatory, just curious, but it still cut. Because the truth was, Mara didn't know. She tried to be enough, tried to fill all the spaces a child needed filled, but she was one person, and there were some gaps that stayed empty no matter how hard she worked to close them. "It has to be," she said finally. Jonah set down his cup. "What about you? What about me? Is it enough for you? Being enough for her?" Mara's hands stilled on the shirt she was mending. The question reached into places she didn't let herself examine, pulled at threads she'd learned to leave alone. "I don't think about it," she said. "Maybe you should." She looked up then, met his eyes across the small table. There was something in his expression, something raw and unguarded, that made her chest ache. "Why do you come here, Jonah?" The words came out before she could stop them, and once they were spoken, they hung in the air between them, heavy and inescapable. Jonah didn't answer right away. He looked at his hands, at the worn wood of the table, at the sleeping child across the room, anywhere but at Mara. "At first," he said slowly, "I told myself it was the food, the company, that I was just tired of eating alone and talking to ranch hands who don't say much besides 'yes, boss.'" "At first," Mara repeated. "Yeah." He finally looked at her. Then I realized I was lying to myself. Her heart was beating too fast. "And what's the truth?" Jonah leaned back in his chair, and the wood creaked under his weight. "Truth is, I lost my wife and son to a fire 7 years ago. House burned while I was out checking fences. By the time I got back, there was nothing left but ash and smoke. His voice was steady, but his hands weren't. I told myself I was done. Done hoping, done trying, done letting anyone close enough to hurt me like that again. Mara's throat closed. Jonah? Let me finish. He took a breath. Then I met you. Met Ellie. And I started writing out here, and I kept telling myself it was nothing, just visits, just passing time. But the truth is, I come here because when I'm here, I remember what it feels like to be part of something, to matter to someone, to... He stopped, jaw working. To feel like maybe I'm not done after all. The silence that followed was so complete, Mara could hear her own heartbeat, could hear Ellie's soft breathing from across the room, could hear the wind pressing against the cabin walls. You do matter, she said finally, voice barely above a whisper. To us. You matter to us. Jonah closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, they were bright with something that might have been tears if he'd let them fall. I needed to hear that, he said roughly. Mara wanted to reach across the table, wanted to take his hand, wanted to close the distance between them and tell him everything she'd been too afraid to say. But before she could move, Ellie stirred on the bed, mumbling something in her sleep, and the moment fractured. Jonah stood, careful not to scrape the chair. I should go, let you both rest. Jonah? I'll bring those vegetables by tomorrow, he said, already moving toward the door. And maybe some venison, if you'll take it. He was running. She could see it in the tension of his shoulders, the way he wouldn't quite look at her. He'd opened himself up, let her see inside, and now he was retreating to safer ground. She should let him go. Should accept the retreat, the return to comfortable distance. But something in her refused. Stay for supper, she said. Jonah stopped with his hand on the door latch. What? Tomorrow, when you bring the vegetables, stay for supper. She stood, forcing herself to meet his eyes. Please. He stared at her for a long moment, and she could see him wrestling with it, the fear, the hope, the terrible vulnerability of saying yes. All right, he said finally. All right, I will. He left then, closing the door quietly behind him, and Mara stood in the middle of her small cabin and tried to remember how to breathe. Jonah came the next evening as promised, his saddlebags loaded with potatoes, carrots, turnips, and a haunch of venison wrapped in cloth. Ellie helped him unload with serious concentration, carrying each item inside as if it were precious treasure. Mara cooked venison stew with some of the vegetables, and they ate at the small table, elbows bumping, Ellie chattering between bites, the cabin warm with steam and firelight. It felt like a family. That was the dangerous thought that Mara couldn't shake. It felt like the kind of evening she'd watched other women have, the kind she'd told herself was meant for different kinds of people. But here it was, happening in her cabin, at her table, with her daughter and a man who looked at her like she was something other than forgettable. After supper, Jonah told Ellie a story about a horse that could outrun the wind, and Ellie fell asleep in Mara's lap, lulled by his deep voice and the crackle of the fire. Mara carried her to bed, tucked her in, then returned to find Jonah standing by the fireplace, studying the flames. Thank you for tonight, she said quietly. Thank you for having me. Jonah, about what you said yesterday. I shouldn't have said it. He turned to face her, put a burden on you that wasn't fair. It wasn't a burden. No? He took a step closer, and suddenly the cabin felt smaller, the air thicker. Then what was it? Mara's hands twisted in her apron. It was honest. And She forced herself to meet his eyes. I'm glad you told me. Why? Because I need to know I'm not the only one feeling... She stopped, the words catching in her throat. Feeling what? Jonah's voice was rough, urgent. He took another step closer, and now there was barely a foot of space between them. Say it, Mara. Her name in his mouth, not Miss Hale, not ma'am, but Mara, sent heat through her chest. She looked up at him, at this enormous, careful man who gentled himself for her daughter, and opened his grief for her to see, and she felt the last of her careful walls crumble. Like maybe I'm not done either, she whispered. Jonah's breath caught. He raised one hand slowly, giving her time to step back, And when she didn't, he cupped her cheek with a gentleness that belied his size. His palm was warm, calloused, trembling slightly. "You're not what people say," he said quietly. "You're not plain. You're not forgettable. You're—" His thumb brushed her cheekbone. "You're everything." Mara's eyes stung. No one had ever said anything like that to her. No one had ever looked at her the way Jonah was looking at her now, like she was precious, like she mattered, like he'd been searching for her without knowing it, and now that he'd found her, he couldn't quite believe she was real. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Of me?" "Of this. Of what happens when people talk, when they say things that make you realize—" She couldn't finish, couldn't voice the fear that had lived in her chest since the day he'd first ridden up to her cabin. But Jonah understood anyway. "Make me realize what? That you're not worth it?" His hand tightened slightly on her face, anchoring her. "Mara, I already know what people think. I've heard the talk, and I'm still here." "Now you are. But when it gets worse, it won't change anything." "You don't know that." "I do." He leaned down, bringing their faces level, and the intensity in his eyes stole her breath. "I spent 7 years alone because I was too afraid to feel anything again. Then I met you, and I felt everything. You think I'm going to walk away from that because some people I don't respect think they have a say in my life? They'll make it hard for you, for your business, your reputation. I don't give a damn about my reputation." His voice was fierce now, almost angry. "I care about you, about Ellie, about sitting at that table and eating stew and feeling like I have a reason to wake up in the morning." Mara felt tears spill over, hot against her cold cheeks. "Jonah, let me say this." He moved his other hand to her face, holding her gently between his palms like she was something that might break. "I know what people see when they look at you. They see a woman alone with a child, struggling, unremarkable. But I see something different. I see someone who survives when survival is hard, who works from dawn to dark without complaining, who loves her daughter so fiercely it makes my chest hurt to watch. I see someone worth choosing, worth fighting for, worth—" His voice cracked. "Worth everything." The words broke something open in Mara that had been closed so long she'd forgotten it existed. She reached up, covering his hands with hers, feeling the rough warmth of his skin, the faint tremor that said he was as undone as she was. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "Neither do I." His forehead touched hers, and they stood there, breathing the same air, holding each other up. "But maybe we figure it out together. People will talk. Let them. They'll say cruel things. They already do. They'll make assumptions. Mara." He pulled back just enough to meet her eyes. "I know you're scared. I'm scared too. But I'm more scared of walking away and spending the rest of my life wondering what this could have been." She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 7 years of loneliness, 4 years of raising Ellie alone, a lifetime of being overlooked and dismissed. And beneath that weight, fragile and stubborn as new grass through snow, something that might have been hope. "Stay," she said. "Tonight, just stay. Sleep by the fire, but stay." It was improper, dangerous, the kind of thing that would fuel gossip for months if anyone found out. But Mara was tired of living her life according to other people's rules, other people's judgments. Jonah nodded slowly. "I'll stay." He did. He banked the fire, spread his bedroll on the floor near the hearth, and lay down fully clothed. Mara retreated to the bed she shared with Ellie, pulling her daughter close, and listened to Jonah's breathing slow into sleep. It was the first time in 4 years she'd fallen asleep knowing someone was watching over them. And the relief of it was so overwhelming she had to press her face into Ellie's hair to muffle the sound of her crying. When morning came, Jonah was gone, but there was fresh firewood stacked by the door and coffee waiting in the pot, still warm. Mara stood on the porch with her cup, watching the sunrise paint the prairie gold and pink, and let herself believe just for a moment that maybe she was allowed to have this. The belief lasted 3 days. On Saturday, Mara rode into town for supplies, Ellie perched behind her as always. The general store was crowded, and the moment she walked through the door, conversation stuttered and stopped. She felt the weight of eyes on her back, heard the whispers that weren't quite quiet enough. Staying overnight now, I heard. Shameless, really. That poor child. What kind of example? Mara kept her spine straight and her face blank, moving through the aisles with mechanical efficiency. She gathered flour, salt, coffee, the bare necessities, and brought them to the counter where Mr. Hartley stood, his expression carefully neutral. "That'll be $2.30, he said. Mara counted out the money, aware of the silence pressing against her back, and when she turned to leave, she found her path blocked by Margaret Townsend, the banker's wife, flanked by two other women whose names Mara couldn't remember. "Miss Hale," Margaret said, her voice dripping false concern, "might we have a word?" Every instinct told Mara to push past, to ignore them, to get Ellie out of this store and away from these women's venom. But Ellie was watching, and running would teach her daughter that shame was deserved. "What can I do for you, Mrs. Townsend?" Margaret smiled, thin and sharp. "We've noticed you've become quite close with Mr. Cross." "Have you?" "It's caused some concern, among the more respectable families. I wasn't aware my friendships required community approval." One of the other women sniffed. "Friendship, is that what you're calling it?" Heat crawled up Mara's neck, but she kept her voice level. "I'm calling it none of your business." Margaret's smile hardened. "When it affects the moral character of this town, Miss Hale, it becomes everyone's business. We have standards to uphold, children to protect. Children like mine?" Mara's hand found Ellie's shoulder, pulled her daughter close. "Or do you mean children who have the right kind of parents? Now there's no need to be defensive. Isn't there?" Mara's voice rose, and she didn't care anymore who was listening. "You've made it clear what you think of me since the day I arrived. Unwed mother, unremarkable, someone to be pitied at best, scorned at worst. The only thing that's changed is that someone finally looked at me and saw something worth his time, and you can't stand it." The store had gone completely silent now. Margaret's face flushed red. "How dare you?" "No." Mara took a step forward, and Margaret actually stepped back. "How dare you? I work harder than anyone in this town. I provide for my daughter. I've never asked for charity, never caused trouble, never done anything but try to survive. And the fact that you think you have the right to judge my life, my choices, my worth—" She stopped, breathing hard. "That says everything about you and nothing about me." She pushed past the women, Ellie's hand gripped tight in hers, and walked out of the store into bright sunlight that felt like exposure, like standing naked in the town square. Behind her, she heard the immediate explosion of voices, the gasps and titters and shocked exclamations. She'd done it now. Crossed a line she couldn't uncross, made herself not just forgettable, but notorious. She was loading the supplies onto the mule with shaking hands when a man's voice spoke behind her. That was something. She turned to find Joseph Trent leaning against the storefront, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "I don't need a lecture, Joseph." "Wasn't going to give you one." He pushed off the wall, came closer. "Actually wanted to say I admired it. That took guts." Mara stared at him. "You're serious." Dead serious. He glanced toward the store, where figures moved behind the windows like shadows. "Most people in there spend their whole lives afraid of what others think. You just told them all to go to hell. That's worth respecting." "Even if it ruins my reputation?" Joseph laughed, short and bitter. "Your reputation was already ruined, Mara. Nothing you said in there changed that. But at least now you've got your dignity." He was right, she realized. The town had already decided what she was. Nothing she did or didn't do would change their minds. The only question was whether she'd live according to their judgment or her own. "Thank you," she said quietly. Joseph tipped his hat. "For what it's worth, Cross is a good man. If he's chosen you, he's got good taste." He smiled slightly. "Even if the rest of us can't see it." He walked away before she could respond, and Mara stood there, holding on to the mule's reins, trying to process the fact that in the space of 10 minutes, she'd made enemies and earned respect from a man she'd thought barely noticed her existence. "Mama?" Ellie tugged on her skirt. "Are we going home now?" Mara looked down at her daughter's worried face and felt something settle in her chest. Home. Yes, that's exactly what they were doing. "Yes, sweetheart, we're going home." They rode out of town without looking back, and when they reached the cabin, Jonah was waiting on the porch. He stood the moment he saw them, and even from a distance, Mara could see the tension in his shoulders, the tight set of his jaw. He'd heard. Somehow, already, he'd heard. She dismounted, helped Ellie down, and walked to where he stood. His eyes searched her face, looking for damage, for cracks. "I heard what happened," he said. "That was fast." Ranch Hand was in town, came back with the news. His hands flexed at his sides. "Are you all right?" Mara thought about it, really thought about it. Was she all right? She just burned every bridge she had in Lincoln, made enemies of the few people who'd been neutral, guaranteed that life in this town would be harder than it already was. But she was standing in front of her cabin with her daughter safe beside her, and a man who'd chosen her looking at her like she was precious. And she realized something that should have been obvious all along. "Yes," she said. "I'm all right." Jonah's expression shifted. Relief, pride, something fiercer. "Good. That's good." He glanced toward town, then back at her. "They're going to make things difficult." "I know. Store might refuse to sell to you. People might—" He stopped, jaw working. "They might be cruel." "They already are. It'll get worse." Mara stepped closer, close enough to see the gold flecks in his brown eyes, close enough to feel the heat coming off his body. "Are you trying to warn me off?" "No." The word came out fierce, immediate. "No, I'm trying to make sure you know what you're getting into, what being with me will cost you." "And what about what it'll cost you? Your reputation, your business relationships?" "Don't care. Jonah, I don't care, Mara." He took her face in his hands, the gesture now familiar, achingly right. "I told you that. The only thing I care about is you and Ellie. The rest of it, the talk, the judgment, all of it, it's just noise." Ellie, who'd been listening quietly, suddenly spoke up. "I like you, Jonah." Both adults looked down at her. She stood with her wooden horse clutched in one hand, her expression solemn and certain. "I like you too, little one," Jonah said softly. "Are you going to stay?" The question hung in the air, and Mara held her breath, because this was what everything had been building toward. This moment, this choice. Jonah looked at Ellie, then at Mara, and something in his face cracked open. "Yeah," he said, voice rough. "Yeah, I'm gonna stay." Ellie nodded, satisfied, and went into the cabin to play. Mara and Jonah stood there in the fading afternoon light, the prairie stretching endlessly around them, and Mara felt the last of her fear drain away. There would be consequences, there would be hardship, but they'd face it together, and that made all the difference. "I meant what I said in town," she told him. "About my life, my choices, my worth. I'm done letting other people define those things." "Good." Jonah's thumb traced her cheekbone. "Because I've been trying to tell you what you're worth, and you haven't been listening." "I'm listening now." He smiled, that rare transformative thing that made him look years younger. "Then hear this. You're worth everything, Mara Hale. Everything I have, everything I am, and I'm going to make damn sure everyone knows it." And there, on the porch of her small cabin, with the prairie wind lifting her hair and Jonah's hands warm against her face, Mara finally let herself believe it. The next 2 weeks tested that belief in ways Mara hadn't anticipated. The first blow came 3 days after her confrontation in the store, when she returned to town to buy lamp oil and found Mr. Hartley waiting behind the counter with an expression that was equal parts apologetic and resolute. "Miss Hale," he said, before she could even ask for what she needed. "I'm afraid I can't serve you anymore." The words hit like a fist to the stomach. "Excuse me?" "Margaret Townsend and the other ladies? They've made it clear that any merchant who does business with you will lose their patronage." He spread his hands helplessly. "I've got a family to feed. Can't afford to lose half my customers." Mara stood there, Ellie's hands small and warm in hers, and felt the practical reality of ostracism settle over her like a weight. No general store meant no flour, no salt, no coffee, no lamp oil, no fabric for clothes, no nails for repairs. It meant riding 20 miles to the next town for basic necessities, or doing without. "I understand," she said quietly, though she didn't. Didn't understand how people could be so cruel over something that had nothing to do with them. Didn't understand how grown adults could wield their power like weapons against a woman who'd done nothing but survive. She turned to leave, but Hartley called after her. For what it's worth, Miss Hale, I think what they're doing is wrong, but I can't. I know, she said without turning around. You can't afford to be kind. She walked out into the street, and this time when people stared, she felt the difference. Before, she'd been invisible, unless they wanted to judge her. Now she was visible always, marked, a cautionary tale they could point to and say, see what happens when you forget your place. The blacksmith refused to shoe her mule. The seamstress turned her away when she tried to buy thread. Even the church, when Sunday came, went silent as she walked through the door, and Pastor Williams gave a sermon about moral corruption that kept his eyes fixed meaningfully in her direction. Mara sat through it with her spine straight and Ellie pressed against her side, and when it was over, she walked out with her head high. But inside, something was crumbling. Not her resolve, that stayed firm, but her hope that life in Lincoln could ever be bearable again. Jonah noticed immediately. He arrived that afternoon to find her sitting on the porch steps, staring out at nothing, while Ellie played quietly nearby. He dismounted slowly, studying Mara's face, and whatever he saw there made his jaw tighten. What happened? She told him. All of it. The refusals, the stares, the sermon. When she finished, Jonah's hands were clenched into fists at his sides, and his breathing had gone rough with anger. I'll talk to them, he said. No. Mara. No, Jonah. She looked up at him, and her voice was steady, even though everything inside her felt shaky. That'll just make it worse. They want to punish me, and you defending me will only convince them they're right to do it. So what? You just accept it? Let them starve you out? I don't know. The admission felt like defeat. I don't know what to do. Jonah stood there for a long moment, muscles tense with the need to act, to fix, to fight. Then he crouched in front of her, taking her hands in his. Listen to me, he said fiercely. You're not alone in this. Whatever you need, food, supplies, anything, I'll provide it. And if that town won't sell to you, then damn them. We don't need them. You need them. For your business, your ranch. I need you more. The words hung between them, raw and unguarded, and Mara felt tears prick her eyes. You say that now. I'll say it always. He squeezed her hands. You hear me? Always. This isn't something I'm going to walk away from when it gets hard. I already lived through hard. I already survived losing everything, and I'm telling you right now, losing you would be worse. Mara's breath caught. Jonah, let me help you, he said. Please, let me be useful for something other than splitting wood and scaring off coyotes. She wanted to refuse, wanted to insist she could manage alone the way she always had, but the truth was she couldn't. Not anymore. The town had made sure of that. All right, she whispered. Relief flooded Jonah's face. All right, good. I'll bring supplies tomorrow, and He stopped, something shifting in his expression. Actually, there's something else we need to talk about. What? He stood, pulling her up with him, and took a deep breath like he was bracing himself. I want you to marry me. The world tilted. Mara stared at him, unable to process the words, unable to make them mean what they seemed to mean. What? Marry me, Jonah said again, and now that he'd started, the words came faster, tumbling over each other. I know it's fast, I know people will say things, but if we're married, they can't. They'll have to. He stopped, shook his head. That's not why. That's not the only reason. Then what is? He cupped her face in both hands, and his eyes were bright with something that looked like fear and hope mixed together. Because I love you. Because I wake up thinking about you and fall asleep wishing I was here. Because Ellie looks at me like I matter, and you look at me like I'm worth something, and I want that for the rest of my life. Because being with you makes me remember what it feels like to be alive. Mara couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stand there with his hands on her face and his words rearranging everything she thought she knew about her life. You love me? She whispered. Yes. But I'm not. She struggled to find words. I'm plain, ordinary, I can't give you anything but work and worry and a child who isn't yours. Stop. Jonah's voice was rough. Stop saying those things like they're true. You're not plain. You're beautiful in ways that matter, strong and honest and stubborn and kind. And Ellie, His voice cracked. Ellie is the best thing that's ever happened to me besides you. I would be honored to call her mine. The tears came then, hot and unstoppable. Mara had spent so many years being told what she wasn't, not pretty enough, not proper enough, not worthy of anything but judgment, that she'd forgotten how to imagine someone might see her differently. But Jonah did. He looked at her and saw something precious, something worth choosing, something worth loving. I love you too, she said through her tears. I've been trying not to, trying to protect myself, but I do. I love you. Jonah made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and pulled her against his chest. He was warm and solid and safe, and Mara pressed her face into his shirt and let herself shake apart, knowing he would hold the pieces. Is that a yes? He asked into her hair. She pulled back just enough to see his face. Yes? Yes, I'll marry you. The smile that broke across Jonah's face was worth everything, worth the town's cruelty, worth the fear, worth all of it. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, the tip of her nose, and finally, gently, her mouth. It was Mara's first kiss in 5 years, and it tasted like salt and hope and home. When they finally broke apart, they found Ellie standing a few feet away, watching with solemn curiosity. Are you getting married? She asked. Jonah crouched down to her level. Would that be all right with you? Ellie considered this seriously. Would you live here? If your mama wants me to, yes. Would you be my papa? Jonah's breath caught. He glanced up at Mara, and she nodded through her tears, and when he looked back at Ellie, his eyes were wet too. I would be honored to be your papa, he said quietly. Ellie thought about this for approximately 3 seconds, then threw herself at him with enough force to knock him backward. Jonah caught her, laughing, and stood with the child wrapped around him like a burr, her face buried in his neck. Okay, she said, muffled. You can marry Mama. Mara watched them, this enormous, careful man and her small, fierce daughter, and felt something settle in her chest that had been restless for as long as she could remember. This was what belonging felt like. This was what family looked like when you got to choose it instead of just enduring it. They married 3 weeks later. Not in the church. Pastor Williams made it clear that wouldn't be welcome. Instead, they rode 20 miles to Santa Fe and found a judge willing to perform the ceremony in his office with 2 clerks as witnesses. Mara wore her best dress, which wasn't much, and Jonah wore a clean shirt and looked at her like she was wearing silk. Ellie stood between them, holding the wooden horse Jonah had carved, and when the judge said, "You may kiss your bride," she giggled so hard she had to sit down. Afterward, Jonah took them to a restaurant, the fanciest place Mara had ever been, and they ate roast beef and potatoes while Ellie stared wide-eyed at the chandelier overhead. Other diners glanced at them curiously, but here, in a city where no one knew their story, the looks were merely curious, not cruel. Here, they were just a family having dinner. Normal. Unremarkable. It was the best meal of Mara's life. They stayed in Santa Fe that night. Jonah rented 2 rooms at a hotel, one for him and Mara, one for Ellie, and for the first time in her life, Mara slept in a real bed with clean sheets and a man she loved beside her. Jonah held her carefully, like he was afraid she might break, and she pressed her face into his chest and breathed in the smell of soap and leather and something that was just him. Are you happy? He asked into the darkness. Yes. She'd never meant anything more. Are you? More than I thought I'd ever be again. They lay there in the quiet, listening to the sounds of the city outside. Horses, voices, the distant clatter of a piano, and Mara let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, the hard part was over. She was wrong. They returned to the cabin 2 days later to find it ransacked. The door hung open on broken hinges. Inside, flour and sugar spilled across the floor, mixed with shattered glass from the lamp. Her few dishes lay in pieces. The bed frame was broken, the mattress slashed, stuffing pulled out in handfuls. Someone had gone through every drawer, every shelf, destroying everything they could reach. Even Ellie's wooden animals were scattered and broken. The carved horse Jonah had made lying in 2 pieces near the fireplace. Mara stood in the doorway, unable to move, unable to process the magnitude of the violation. This wasn't just damage. This was hate made tangible. This was someone saying, "You don't belong, you never did, and we'll make sure you know it." Ellie pushed past her, saw the destruction, and made a small wounded sound. She ran to the broken horse, picked up the pieces, and looked at Jonah with tears streaming down her face. "They broke him," she whispered. Jonah's face had gone blank, the kind of blank that hid rage too big to safely express. He crossed to Ellie, crouched down, and took the broken pieces gently from her hands. "I can fix him," he said quietly. "I promise. He'll be good as new." "But they broke him," Ellie said again, and Mara realized her daughter wasn't just talking about the horse. She was talking about the violation, the cruelty, the fact that someone had come into their home, their safe place, and destroyed it. "I know, little one." Jonah pulled Ellie into his arms and looked over her head at Mara. The rage in his eyes was barely contained, but his voice stayed gentle. "But some things can be fixed, and the things that can't, we'll make new ones, better ones." Mara finally moved. She stepped into the cabin, glass crunching under her boots, and surveyed the damage with a strange, distant calm. This should hurt more, she thought. This should break her. But instead, all she felt was a cold, clear certainty. "We can't stay here," she said. Jonah looked up sharply. "What?" "We can't stay here. Not in Lincoln. Not near people who would do this." She gestured at the destruction. "I won't raise my daughter in a place where hate walks through our door when we're not looking." "Mara, I'm not running," she said, meeting his eyes. "I'm choosing. There's a difference." Jonah stood slowly, still holding Ellie. "Where would we go?" "Your ranch. You said you had room." "I do, but—" He stopped, studied her face. "You're sure?" Was she? Leaving this cabin meant abandoning the only independence she'd ever had, meant becoming dependent on Jonah in ways that scared her. But staying meant accepting this violation, meant teaching Ellie that they deserved this treatment, meant living every day looking over her shoulder waiting for the next attack. "I'm sure," she said. Jonah nodded slowly. Then he looked around the cabin and his jaw tightened. "We'll take what can be salvaged. The rest—" He stopped, shook his head. "The rest doesn't matter. Things can be replaced." They worked in silence, gathering what was still usable. Some clothes, a few unbroken jars, Mara's mother's quilt that had somehow survived intact. It wasn't much. Most of their life here lay in ruins on the floor. When they'd loaded everything onto Jonah's wagon, Mara took one last look at the cabin. 4 years she'd lived here. 4 years of work and worry and small joys. 4 years of trying to build something that was hers. And now she was leaving it behind, not because she wanted to, but because people had made it impossible to stay. "I'm sorry," Jonah said quietly beside her. "For what?" "For this. For being the reason they—" "Stop." Mara turned to face him. "You're not the reason. Their cruelty is the reason. Their fear of anything that doesn't fit in their small, narrow world. That has nothing to do with you and everything to do with them." "Still feels like my fault." "Well, it's not." She took his hand, laced their fingers together. "And I'm not sorry. Not for loving you, not for marrying you, not for any of it. The only thing I'm sorry for is that we didn't leave sooner." Jonah squeezed her hand, and they stood there for a moment, saying goodbye to a place that had been shelter but never quite home. Then they climbed onto the wagon, Mara and Ellie on the seat, Jonah beside them, and rode north toward the Cross Ranch without looking back. The ranch was bigger than Mara had imagined. The main house sat in a valley with hills rising on 3 sides, built of stone and timber, solid and permanent in a way her cabin had never been. Behind it, corrals and outbuildings spread across the land. A barn, a bunkhouse for the ranch hands, storage sheds, a chicken coop. Horses grazed in the near pasture, and further out, cattle dotted the hillsides like brown stones. It was beautiful, and it was terrifying. Jonah pulled the wagon up to the house and set the brake, then turned to Mara with an uncertain expression she'd never seen on him before. "I know it's not what you're used to," he said, "and I know having the ranch hands around takes some getting used to. But I promise, they're good men. They'll respect you." Mara looked at the house, at the size of it, at the way it sat in the land like it had grown there naturally. "It's wonderful," she said honestly. I'm not sure I belong in something this big. You belong wherever you decide to be, Jonah said firmly. This is your home now, yours and Ellie's, and anyone who has a problem with that can find work elsewhere. As if summoned, 3 men emerged from the barn. They approached the wagon slowly, curiously, and Mara felt herself tensing. She'd lived alone so long, the idea of being surrounded by strange men, even ones who worked for Jonah, made her stomach clench. But Jonah seemed to sense her discomfort. He climbed down from the wagon and held out a hand to help her down, positioning himself between her and the approaching men. Boys, he said evenly, this is my wife, Mara, and her daughter, Ellie. They'll be living here from now on, and I expect you to treat them with respect. The men stopped, exchanged glances, and the oldest of them, a grizzled man with a gray beard, stepped forward. Ma'am, he said, touching his hat, name's Cal. I'm the foreman here. These are Pete and Sam. He gestured at the other 2, younger men who nodded awkwardly. We're pleased to have you. Mara studied them, looking for judgment, for the kind of calculating cruelty she'd come to expect, but all she saw was curiosity and a careful politeness that seemed genuine. Thank you, she said quietly. Cal, Jonah said, help me unload the wagon, would you? The ladies need to get settled. The men moved to help, and Jonah took Mara's hand and led her toward the house. Ellie followed close behind, clutching her broken horse and looking around with wide eyes. Inside, the house was sparse but clean, clearly the home of a man who'd been living alone. There was a main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area with a cast-iron stove, and 2 doors leading to what Mara assumed were bedrooms. The furniture was simple but well-made, the floors swept, the windows clean. It needs a woman's touch, Jonah said, sounding almost apologetic. I'm not much for decoration. Mara turned slowly, taking it all in. There was space here, actual space, room to move and breathe and exist without constantly bumping into walls. There was a real stove for cooking, real windows that let in light, real doors that closed and locked. It's perfect, she said, and meant it. Jonah's shoulders relaxed. Your room is through there, he said, pointing to the larger of the 2 doors. Ellie can have the other one, unless... He stopped, suddenly awkward. Unless you want her closer to you. I can sleep in the other room, give you both the main bedroom. Jonah, Mara stepped closer, took his hand. We're married. I want to sleep beside you. Relief and something warmer flooded his face. All right, good. That's good. Ellie had already disappeared into the smaller bedroom, and they heard her gasp of delight. Mara followed the sound and found her daughter standing in the middle of a room that was small but bright, with a real bed and a chest of drawers, and a window that looked out over the pasture. Is this mine? Ellie asked, spinning around. It's yours, Jonah confirmed from the doorway. Ellie ran to him and wrapped her arms around his legs. Thank you, Papa. The word hit Jonah visibly. He crouched down, pulling Ellie into a proper hug, and Mara saw his eyes close, his jaw working with emotion he was trying to contain. You're welcome, little one, he said roughly. That night, after Ellie had fallen asleep in her new room and the ranch hands had retired to the bunkhouse, Mara and Jonah stood in their bedroom, a thing Mara still couldn't quite believe, and looked at each other across the space. This is real, Mara said softly. We actually did this. We did. Jonah crossed to her, pulled her against him. Having regrets? No. She pressed her face into his chest, breathed in his familiar smell. Just having trouble believing it. That I get to have this. Have you. I'm the one who can't believe it. Jonah's hand came up to stroke her hair. I thought I was done, Mara. Done hoping, done wanting, done believing in second chances. Then you walked into my life and reminded me what living felt like. Mara pulled back to look at him. We're going to be all right, aren't we? Yes. He said it with absolute certainty. The town might hate us, might make things difficult, but we have each other. We have this place. We have everything we need. What about what we want? Jonah smiled, that rare, beautiful thing that transformed his whole face. I've got everything I want right here. He kissed her then, deep and slow and full of promise, and Mara let herself sink into it, let herself believe that maybe, Finally, the universe had decided she'd suffered enough. That maybe she was allowed to be happy, to be loved, to be chosen. Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the grass, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. But inside, in this solid house with locked doors and a man who loved her, Mara felt safe. For the first time in years, she felt safe. The feeling lasted exactly 1 week. 7 days after they moved to the ranch, Mara woke to the smell of smoke. Not wood smoke from the stove or the fireplace, but something sharper, more acrid, something wrong. She sat up in bed, heart already racing, and found Jonah's side empty and cold. Through the window, the sky was still dark, hours before dawn, but an orange glow flickered in the distance. She was out of bed and moving before conscious thought caught up, pulling on her dress, her boots, running for Ellie's room. The child was already awake, sitting up in bed with frightened eyes. "Mama? Come here, sweetheart." Mara scooped her daughter up, blanket and all, and carried her to the main room. Through the window, she could see flames rising from the direction of the southern pasture and figures moving in silhouette against the firelight, Jonah and the ranch hands already fighting it. Cal burst through the front door, his face streaked with soot. "Mrs. Cross, you and the little one need to stay inside. Keep the doors and windows shut. We're trying to contain it, but if the wind shifts..." "How bad is it?" "Bad enough." His expression was grim. "Started in 3 places at once. This wasn't lightning or accident. Someone set this." The words landed like stones. Someone had come onto their land in the night and set fire to their property, their livelihood, their home. The same hate that had destroyed her cabin had followed them here. "Where's Jonah?" "With the herd, trying to move them north before the fire reaches them." "Ma'am, I need to get back out there." "Go!" Mara set Ellie down, her mind already calculating. "I'll keep her safe." Cal nodded and ran back out into the smoke-thick darkness. Mara locked the door behind him, checked every window, then returned to Ellie and pulled her close. "Is the house going to burn?" Ellie asked, her voice small. "No, baby. The house is stone. It won't burn." Mara hoped that was true. Hoped the men could stop the fire before it reached the outbuildings, the barn, the things that could burn. "We're safe here." They waited in the dark, Ellie pressed against Mara's side, and watched through the window as orange light painted the prairie. Mara could hear shouting, the frightened lowing of cattle, the sharp crack of something wooden collapsing. Every instinct screamed at her to run out there, to help, to do something other than sit helpless while everything burned. But she had Ellie to protect, and running toward fire with a child in her arms would only make things worse. So she stayed, and she waited, and she prayed to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore that Jonah would come back to her whole. Dawn was breaking when the door finally opened again. Jonah stood in the doorway, blackened with soot and ash, his clothes singed, one hand wrapped in what looked like a torn shirt. But he was alive. He was standing. Mara was across the room before she knew she'd moved, her hands on his face, his chest, checking for damage, for burns, for anything that needed tending. "I'm all right," he said hoarsely. "We got it stopped before it reached the main structures. Lost about 50 acres of grazing land and 2 sections of fence. But the cattle are safe, the buildings are safe. His voice cracked. "We're all right." Mara wrapped her arms around him despite the soot, despite the smell of smoke, and held on tight. He was shaking, she realized. This enormous, solid man was shaking with exhaustion and fear and rage. "Who did this?" she asked against his chest. "Don't know for certain, but Cal found boot prints near where the fires started and fresh tracks leading back toward town." Jonah's arms tightened around her. "Someone came here in the night and tried to burn us out." "Papa?" Ellie's voice was tentative from across the room. "Are you hurt?" Jonah pulled back from Mara, seemed to gather himself, and crossed to crouch in front of Ellie. "Just some scratches, little one. Nothing serious." But Ellie's eyes had gone to his wrapped hand, and she reached out to touch it gently. "You're bleeding." "A bit. Your mama will fix it." "Mama fixes everything," Ellie said with absolute certainty, and despite everything, the fire, the fear, the exhaustion, Jonah smiled. "Yes," he agreed, "she does." Mara spent the next hour cleaning and bandaging Jonah's burned hand while he sat at the kitchen table and stared at nothing. The injury wasn't as bad as it could have been, second-degree burns across his palm where he'd grabbed something hot, but it was painful enough that he flinched when she applied the salve. "Sorry," she murmured. "Don't be. I've had worse." Cal came in as she was finishing the bandaging, his face haggard. "Boss, Pete and Sam are bedding down in the bunkhouse. I sent them to get some sleep. They've been up all night. I'll take first watch in case whoever did this decides to come back." "No one's coming back," Jonah said flatly. "They did what they came to do. Made their point. And what point is that? That we're not welcome here. That marrying her," he gestured at Mara without looking at her, "was crossing a line they won't forgive." Mara's hand stilled on the bandage. "Jonah, it's true, isn't it?" He looked at her then, and his eyes were hollow. "None of this started until I chose you. The gossip, the store refusing service, your cabin being destroyed, all of it because I was fool enough to think we could be happy without permission from people who don't matter." "Stop that." Mara's voice came out sharper than she intended. "You're not a fool, and this isn't your fault." "Isn't it? If I'd kept my distance, if you'd kept your distance, I'd still be alone in that cabin with Ellie. Still invisible. Still surviving, but not living." She cupped his soot-stained face in both hands, forcing him to look at her. "Yes, people are cruel. Yes, they're trying to punish us. But that doesn't mean we made the wrong choice. That means they're the ones who are wrong." Cal cleared his throat awkwardly. "Ma'am's right, boss. This isn't on you. This is on whoever's small enough to think burning a man's property is justified." Jonah was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I want to know who did this. I'll ride into town later," Cal offered. "See what I can find out. Someone always knows something, even if they won't admit it at first." "Be careful," Jonah said. "If they're willing to do this, they might be willing to do worse." Cal nodded and left, and Mara finished bandaging Jonah's hand in silence. When she was done, she didn't let go. Just held his injured hand in both of hers and tried to will some of her strength into him. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "For what?" "For bringing this into your life. You and Ellie, you deserve better than this." "We have exactly what we deserve," Mara said firmly. "A home, a family, someone who loves us. The fact that other people can't stand to see us happy says nothing about us and everything about them." Jonah looked at their joined hands, at the stark white bandage against his burned skin. "What if it gets worse? What if next time they don't just burn grazing land? What if they come for the house, for—" He stopped, jaw working. "For Ellie?" The fear in his voice was raw and real, and Mara felt an answering fear spike through her own chest. But she pushed it down, locked it away, because one of them had to stay steady. "Then we'll deal with it," she said, "together. But we don't run, Jonah. We don't let them win." "I don't want to be brave anymore," he admitted, and the words sounded like they'd been pulled from somewhere deep. "I just want to keep you safe." "Then do that. Keep us safe. But don't for 1 second think that means we made a mistake loving each other." Jonah pulled her close, buried his face in her hair, and she felt him shudder with everything he was trying to hold inside. They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other up while the morning light strengthened outside and smoke still drifted across the prairie like a warning. Cal returned from town that afternoon with information and anger in equal measure. "Wasn't hard to find out who," he said without preamble, standing in the main room with his hat clutched in his hands. "Half the town's talking about it. Group of men from the church, led by Margaret Townsend's husband, Thomas." Mara's stomach dropped. Of course. Of course it would be the banker and his righteous friends, the ones who decided that moral purity gave them the right to destroy other people's lives. "You're certain?" Jonah asked. Pete recognized the boot prints. Thomas Townsend wears custom boots made in Santa Fe, distinctive tread. And one of the men at the saloon was drunk enough to brag that someone finally did something about the cross situation. Cal's expression was disgusted. "They think they're heroes, boss. Think they're protecting the town's virtue." Jonah stood slowly, and something in his posture made Mara's breath catch. She'd never seen him look like this, cold, controlled, dangerous. This wasn't the gentle man who carved horses for her daughter or held her through nightmares. This was someone else entirely. "Where are you going?" she asked, though she already knew. To town. To talk to Thomas Townsend. Jonah, no. They burned my land, Mara, endangered my family. You think I'm going to let that stand? I think going into town angry is exactly what they want you to do, Mara said, stepping in front of him. They want you to lose control, to give them a reason to say you're dangerous, unstable, not fit to what? Marry you? They already decided that. Not fit to keep this ranch, not fit to stay in this territory. She put her hands on his chest, felt his heart hammering beneath her palms. Jonah, listen to me. If you go into town and confront Thomas, if you lay one hand on him, they'll use it against you. They'll call the sheriff, maybe even the territorial marshal. They'll take everything from you, and they'll do it legally. So what, I just do nothing? Let them think they can terrorize us without consequences? No. Mara's voice was steady, even though everything inside her was shaking. We do this smart. We gather evidence. We go to the sheriff with proof, the boot prints, the witness testimony, all of it. We make them answer for what they did through the law, not through violence. Jonah stared at her, breathing hard. And if the sheriff won't help, if he's in Townsend's pocket like everyone else in this town, then we go higher, to the territorial authorities, to someone who doesn't have a stake in keeping the town's most prominent citizens happy. She tightened her grip on his shirt. But we don't give them the satisfaction of watching you destroy yourself. We don't let them turn you into the villain of their story. Slowly, incrementally, some of the tension drained from Jonah's shoulders. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were less cold, more weary. You're right, he said quietly. You're right. I know. She pulled him close, and he wrapped his arms around her carefully, mindful of his burned hand. I want them to pay too, but not at the cost of everything we've built. Cal cleared his throat. Ma'am's got a good head on her shoulders, boss. And for what it's worth, I'll testify about what I saw. Pete and Sam, too. We'll make sure the truth comes out. Jonah nodded against Mara's hair. All right, we do it her way. We go to the sheriff tomorrow with everything we have, and we demand justice. But when they rode into town the next morning, Jonah, Mara, and Cal, they found Sheriff Morrison in his office, looking uncomfortable before they'd even stated their business. Mr. Cross, he said, standing behind his desk like it was a shield. I heard about the fire. Terrible thing. Terrible. It was arson, Jonah said flatly. We have proof. Boot prints, witness testimony placing Thomas Townsend and several other men from the church near my property the night it happened. Morrison's discomfort deepened. Now, Mr. Cross, those are serious accusations, backed by evidence. Cal stepped forward, dropping a piece of paper on the desk. I drew the boot print. It matches Thomas Townsend's custom boots exactly, and we have a witness willing to testify that he heard men bragging about doing something about the Cross situation. The sheriff looked at the drawing, then at them, and Mara saw the moment he made his choice. Saw him decide that protecting the town's prominent citizens mattered more than justice. The thing is, Morrison said slowly, boot prints aren't conclusive. Lots of men might have similar boots, and drunk talk in a saloon isn't reliable testimony. He spread his hands apologetically. Without more concrete evidence, there's nothing I can do. Nothing you can do, Jonah repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. Or nothing you're willing to do. Mr. Cross, I understand you're upset, but you can't go around accusing respected members of the community without solid proof. Respected? Mara stepped forward, and both men looked at her in surprise, as if they'd forgotten she was there. Sheriff, those respected men came onto our property in the night and deliberately set fires that could have killed livestock, destroyed buildings, maybe even hurt people. And you're telling us that's not worth investigating because they're respected? Morrison's face flushed. Mrs. Cross, I'm sure you're understandably emotional, but don't. The word came out sharp as a knife. Don't dismiss what I'm saying because you think I'm emotional. I'm stating facts. Arson was committed. We have evidence. You're refusing to act on that evidence because the men who committed it have money and standing in this community. That's not law enforcement, Sheriff. That's cowardice. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Morrison's flush deepened to angry red and his hands clenched on the desk. I think you folks should leave now, he said tightly, before you say something you'll regret. We already regret coming here, Jonah said. Clearly justice isn't something we'll find in Lincoln. He turned and walked out, and Mara followed with Cal close behind. They were halfway to the horses when a voice called out, "Mr. Cross! Wait!" They turned to find Joseph Trent hurrying across the street, his expression urgent. "I heard what happened," he said quietly. "The fire. And I heard some of what was said in the sheriff's office just now." "Were you eavesdropping?" Cal asked, not unkindly. "Window was open." Joseph glanced around, making sure no one was close enough to hear. "Look, I can't help you officially, but I know someone who might be able to. There's a territorial judge who comes through Santa Fe regularly, Judge Harrison. He's got no love for small-town corruption, and he's got the authority to override local law enforcement if he thinks there's cause." "And why would he listen to us?" Jonah asked. "Because I'll write him a letter," Joseph said, "explaining what I've seen, what I know about how this town operates. It won't be much, but it might be enough to get him to look into things." He met Mara's eyes. "You stood up to those women in the general store, spoke truth when it would have been easier to stay quiet. Figure I owe you the same courtesy." Mara felt her throat tighten. "Thank you, Joseph." "Don't thank me yet. This might not amount to anything, but it's better than nothing." He glanced at Jonah. "And Mr. Cross, whatever you're thinking about doing to Thomas Townsend and his friends, don't. They're waiting for you to give them a reason to run you out of the territory. Don't give it to them." Jonah's jaw was tight, but he nodded. "I'll try. Try hard." Joseph tipped his hat and walked away, leaving them standing in the street with the ghost of hope and the weight of everything that still needed doing. They rode back to the ranch in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When they arrived, they found Ellie on the porch with Sam, who was teaching her how to braid rope. The child looked up as they approached, her face lighting up. "Mama, look what I made!" She held up a short, lumpy braid that was more knot than anything, but her pride in it was absolute. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," Mara said, dismounting and climbing the steps to admire it properly. "Sam says if I practice, I can help fix the broken fences." "That's so." Mara glanced at the ranch hand, who grinned. "Figure if she's going to grow up on a ranch, might as well learn ranch work," Sam said. "Hope that's all right, ma'am." "It's fine. Thank you for looking after her." Sam nodded and excused himself, and Mara sat on the porch step with Ellie while Jonah and Cal tended to the horses. The afternoon was warm, the sky clear, and if you didn't look toward the southern pasture where blackened earth still smoked faintly, you could almost pretend everything was normal. "Mama?" Ellie leaned against her side. "Are the bad people going to come back?" Mara's heart clenched. She'd hoped Ellie was too young to fully understand what was happening, but children always knew more than adults wanted to believe. "I don't know, baby, but your papa and I are going to do everything we can to keep you safe." "I'm not scared," Ellie said, but the way she pressed closer suggested otherwise. "Papa's big. He can protect us." "Yes, he can." Mara stroked her daughter's hair. "And we can protect each other, too." Ellie was quiet for a moment, then, "Why do people hate us?" The question was so direct, so painfully innocent that Mara struggled to find an answer that was both honest and gentle. "They don't hate us exactly," she said finally. "They hate that we're different, that we don't fit into the boxes they think people should fit into. Your papa and I, we weren't supposed to fall in love, wasn't supposed to get married, and when we did it anyway, it made them uncomfortable because it reminded them that people don't always follow the rules they think are important. But we didn't do anything bad. No, sweetheart, we didn't. Then why do they get to be mean?" It was the kind of question that had no good answer, the kind that revealed how fundamentally unfair the world could be. Mara pulled Ellie into her lap and held her close. Because sometimes people choose meanness over kindness, choose fear over love. And when they do that, all we can do is make sure we don't become like them. She kissed the top of Ellie's head. "Promise me something, Ellie. Promise me you'll always choose kindness, even when other people don't." "I promise, Mama." They sat there together as the sun moved across the sky, and Mara let herself hold her daughter and pretend, just for a moment, that love and kindness were enough to keep them safe. That night, after Ellie was asleep and the ranch had gone quiet, Mara found Jonah standing outside, staring toward town. She came up beside him silently, and he wrapped an arm around her without speaking. "I keep thinking about what you said," he finally murmured. About not giving them what they want, not letting them turn me into the villain. You're thinking you want to anyway. Yeah, he pulled her closer. Every instinct I have is screaming at me to ride into town, find Thomas Townsend, and make him pay for what he did, for what he's still doing. But you won't. No, because you're right. It would just make things worse. But Mara, I need you to understand something. He turned to face her, his expression serious. If they come here again, if they threaten you or Ellie, I won't hold back. Law or no law, consequences or not, I will do whatever it takes to keep you safe. Mara looked up at him, at this man who'd opened his broken heart to her, who'd chosen her despite everything it cost, who loved her daughter like she was his own. And she realized that his willingness to destroy himself to protect them wasn't weakness. It was the fiercest kind of strength. I know, she said softly. And if it comes to that, I'll stand beside you, whatever happens. Jonah's eyes closed briefly, and when he opened them, they were bright with unshed tears. I don't deserve you. Yes, you do. We deserve each other. She took his face in her hands. We deserve happiness, Jonah. We deserve a life that's more than just surviving. And we're going to have it, no matter how hard they try to take it from us. He kissed her then, deep and desperate, and full of everything they couldn't say out loud. And when they finally broke apart, they stood there under the stars, two people who'd been broken by life and had somehow found each other in the wreckage and held on tight. 3 days later, word came that Judge Harrison was coming to Lincoln. Joseph Trent rode out to the ranch himself to deliver the news, his face cautiously optimistic. His letter says he's received multiple complaints about irregularities in how justice is administered in the territory, and Lincoln specifically has drawn his attention, Joseph explained, standing in their main room with his hat in his hands. He'll be here in 2 weeks to conduct interviews and review cases. If you present your evidence then, the boot prints, the witness testimony, everything, he'll have the authority to act on it. And if he doesn't believe us? Mara asked. Then at least you'll have tried. Joseph met her eyes. But Harrison has a reputation for being fair, for not bending to political pressure. If anyone will listen, it's him. After Joseph left, Jonah paced the room like a caged animal, energy radiating off him in waves. 2 weeks, he muttered. 2 more weeks of waiting, wondering if they'll strike again, if— 2 weeks isn't that long, Mara interrupted. We can do this, Jonah. We just have to hold on a little longer. He stopped pacing and looked at her, really looked, and something in his expression softened. How do you stay so strong? Because I have something worth being strong for. She crossed to him, took his hands. You, Ellie. This life we're building, that's worth enduring anything for. Jonah pulled her into his arms and held her like she was the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. And maybe she was. Maybe they were each other's anchors, keeping each other from drifting into the kind of despair that swallowed hope whole. We're going to be all right, she whispered against his chest. We're going to be all right. She said it like a prayer, like a promise, like saying it enough times might make it true. And in that moment, standing in their home with the prairie wind sighing around them and danger still lurking in the shadows, she almost believed it. The 2 weeks that followed moved with the strange, suspended quality of waiting for a storm to break. Jonah doubled the watch on the ranch, keeping one man awake at all hours to patrol the perimeter. Cal slept with his rifle beside him, and Pete and Sam took turns checking the fences and outbuildings every night. The tension wore on all of them, visible in the tight set of Jonah's shoulders, in the way Cal's eyes swept constantly across the horizon, and how Mara found herself startling at every unexpected sound. But Ellie seemed oblivious to the danger, or maybe she was just better at pretending. She followed the ranch hands around during the day, learning their work with the serious concentration of a child who wanted to be useful. Sam taught her how to feed the chickens without getting pecked. Pete showed her how to check a horse's hooves for stones, and Jonah, despite his worry, still found time each evening to sit with her and work on repairing the carved horse that had been broken during the cabin raid. Mara watched him one night, his large hands so careful with the delicate work, fitting the pieces together with glue he'd mixed himself and tiny wooden pins he'd whittled to hold everything secure. His injured hand was healing, but she could see him favoring it, working around the pain without complaint. It's going to be stronger than before, he murmured, more to himself than to Ellie, who sat beside him watching with rapt attention. "See here, where it broke? These pins will reinforce it. Make it harder to break next time." "Like us," Ellie said suddenly. Jonah's hands stilled. "What's that, little one?" "We broke too, when the bad people hurt us, but we're getting stronger, like the horse." Jonah looked at Mara across the table, and she saw her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. The realization that their daughter, small as she was, understood more than they'd given her credit for. That she'd taken the violence and fear and somehow transformed it into something she could hold on to, something that made sense. "Yeah," Jonah said softly, returning to his work. "Yeah, exactly like us." The night before Judge Harrison was due to arrive, Mara couldn't sleep. She lay beside Jonah, listening to his steady breathing, and tried to quiet the voice in her head that whispered all the ways this could go wrong. The judge might not believe them. The evidence might not be enough. Thomas Townsend and his friends might have covered their tracks too well, or paid off the right people, or simply be too powerful to touch. And even if the judge did rule in their favor, even if he punished the men who'd burned their land, what then? Would the town accept it? Would they finally leave Jonah and Mara in peace? Or would this just be the beginning of something darker, something that couldn't be solved by law or justice? She must have made some sound, because Jonah stirred beside her, his arm coming around her waist. "Can't sleep?" he murmured against her hair. "Too many thoughts." He pulled her closer, and she pressed her back against his chest, drawing comfort from his solid warmth. "Tell me," he said. "I'm scared. Not of tomorrow, of what comes after. Win or lose, Jonah, we're still going to be the couple that broke the town's rules. We're still going to be the ones they blame for disrupting their comfortable certainties." "You think we should leave?" The question surprised her. "Is that what you want?" "I want you and Ellie to be safe. I want to stop looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next attack." His voice was rough with exhaustion. "If staying here means living like this forever, always afraid, always fighting, then maybe leaving would be better." Mara turned in his arms to face him. In the darkness, she could barely make out his features, but she knew them by heart now. The strong jaw, the weathered skin, the eyes that could be so hard with others and so soft with her. "Where would we go?" "Anywhere. North, maybe. Montana or Wyoming. Fresh start, new territory, people who don't know our history." He touched her face gently. "I've got enough money to buy land elsewhere. Start over. We could be just another family. Nobody special, nobody worth gossiping about." It was tempting. The idea of escaping this constant battle, of finding a place where they could simply exist without judgment or danger. But something in Mara resisted. "If we run now," she said slowly, "we're telling them they won, that their cruelty worked, that we weren't strong enough to stand our ground. Being strong doesn't mean staying in a place that wants us gone. No, but it means not letting them dictate our choices." She laid her hand over his heart, felt it beating steady and strong. "This is your home, Jonah. Your ranch, your land, the place you built with your own hands. I won't let them take that from you. It's just land, Mara, just buildings and fences. You and Ellie, you're what matters. Then trust me when I say I want to stay. I want to fight. I want to show Ellie that when people try to make you small, you stand tall anyway." Her voice strengthened. "And I want those people in town to see us living our lives, being happy, refusing to disappear just because they decided we should." Jonah was quiet for a long moment, his hand stroking her hair in the darkness. Then, "All right, we stay, we fight, we see this through." He kissed her forehead. "But if it gets too dangerous, if they escalate beyond what we can handle, then we'll make that decision together, but not before we've tried everything else." They lay there in the quiet, holding each other, and eventually Mara felt herself starting to drift. Just before sleep took her, she heard Jonah whisper, "I love you," and she whispered it back, and the words felt like armor against whatever morning would bring. Judge Harrison arrived in Lincoln at noon the next day, riding in a closed carriage with a clerk and 2 territorial marshals as escort. Word spread through town within minutes, and by the time Jonah and Mara arrived at the courthouse, a small building next to the sheriff's office, a crowd had already gathered. Mara felt their eyes on her as they dismounted, felt the weight of judgment and curiosity pressing against her skin. She'd worn her best dress and had braided her hair carefully, wanting to look respectable, worthy of being listened to. Beside her, Jonah was stone-faced, his hand resting protectively on the small of her back. Cal met them at the courthouse steps, his expression grim. Harrison's been in there for about an hour already. Talked to the sheriff first, now he's got Thomas Townsend in there. We're next. How do you know? Mara asked. Joseph Trent arranged it. He's inside now, acting as a kind of advocate. Cal glanced at the watching crowd. Whole town's talking. Some are saying Harrison's here to expose Townsend's corruption. Others are saying he's here to run you folks out of the territory for disturbing the peace. Of course they are, Jonah muttered. The courthouse door opened and Joseph emerged, gesturing for them to come inside. Judge is ready for you. They followed him into a small, stuffy room where a gray-haired man in a black suit sat behind a scarred wooden desk. Judge Harrison had the kind of face that gave nothing away, weathered and impassive, with sharp eyes that seemed to look right through you. The two territorial marshals stood against the back wall, and a young clerk sat to the side with paper and pen, ready to record everything. Mr. and Mrs. Cross, Harrison said, his voice deep and measured. Please sit. They sat. Mara folded her hands in her lap to hide their trembling. I've spent the morning hearing various accounts of recent events in Lincoln, Harrison continued, his eyes moving between them. The sheriff tells me there was a fire on your property, Mr. Cross. That you've accused several prominent citizens of arson, but lack sufficient evidence to support those claims. With respect, Your Honor, we have evidence, Jonah said carefully. We have boot prints that match Thomas Townsend's custom footwear. We have witness testimony placing him and several other men from the town near our property the night of the fire. And we have a witness who heard men bragging about doing something about our situation. I've seen the drawing of the boot print, Harrison said. It's suggestive, but not conclusive. As for the testimony, drunken boasting in a saloon isn't always reliable. Mara felt her heart sink. He was going to side with the sheriff, with the town. They'd come all this way, endured all this, for nothing. But then Harrison leaned forward, his expression sharpening. However, I've also spent this morning examining the financial records of several businesses in town, with the cooperation of Mr. Trent here, who has access to such things through his work, and I found some interesting patterns. He pulled out a ledger and opened it to a marked page. It seems that several merchants in Lincoln have recently refused service to you, Mrs. Cross. When I asked them why, they cited concerns about your moral character and influence on the town's children. But Mr. Trent's records show that these same merchants receive significant financial backing from Thomas Townsend's bank, loans with very favorable terms, contingent on maintaining community standards. Mara's breath caught. He's been paying them to refuse service to me? Not paying exactly, but leveraging his financial influence to enforce a kind of social exile. Harrison's eyes were cold, which is, if not illegal, certainly ethically questionable. It suggests a coordinated effort to drive you from the territory, a pattern of behavior that lends credibility to your claims about the arson. So you believe us? Jonah asked, and Mara could hear the hope struggling against disbelief in his voice. I believe there's sufficient cause to investigate further, which is why I've already issued a warrant for Thomas Townsend's arrest, along with warrants for the 3 men witnesses have placed with him the night of the fire. Harrison gestured to the marshals. They're being taken into custody as we speak. The words didn't quite register at first. Mara sat there, processing, trying to understand that they'd actually been heard, actually been believed. What happens now? She managed. Now we conduct a proper investigation. I'll be staying in Lincoln for the next week, interviewing witnesses, examining evidence, and determining whether there's enough to bring formal charges. If I find that arson was indeed committed and that it was part of a broader campaign of harassment, those responsible will face consequences. Harrison's expression was stern. This territory has laws, and they apply to everyone, wealthy bankers and working ranchers alike. Jonah reached for Mara's hand under the table and gripped it tight. Thank you, Your Honor. We just want justice. We just want to be left alone to live our lives. Justice is what I'm here to provide, Harrison said. Though I should warn you, this won't make you popular in town. People don't like having their prejudices challenged, especially when it comes with legal consequences for their leaders. We're not popular now, Mara said quietly. At least this way, we'll be unpopular and safe. Harrison almost smiled. Fair point, Mrs. Cross. He stood, signaling the interview was over. I'll be in touch as the investigation progresses. In the meantime, I'd advise you to stay on your ranch and let the marshals handle things in town. Tensions are likely to run high. They thanked him and left, walking out into the bright afternoon sun to find the crowd had grown larger. People whispered and pointed as they passed, but no one approached. And there, at the edge of the crowd, Mara saw something that made her stop. Margaret Townsend stood with two other women, her face pale and shocked. She was watching the courthouse door where one of the marshals was emerging with her husband in handcuffs, and the devastation on her face was almost painful to see. For a moment, Mara felt something that might have been pity. Margaret had built her entire identity around being respectable, around maintaining the town's moral standards, and now her husband was being arrested for arson. Everything she'd thought she stood for had just crumbled. But then Margaret's eyes met Mara's, and the devastation transformed into pure hatred. This is your fault, she hissed. All of this. If you'd just stayed in your place, none of this would have happened. Mara could have stayed quiet, could have walked away and let the woman have her anger. But she was tired, so tired of being blamed for other people's choices. Your husband chose to commit arson, Mrs. Townsend. He chose to try to burn us out. Those were his decisions, not mine. Mara's voice was steady. The only thing I chose was to love a good man and refuse to be ashamed of it. If that's what destroyed your husband's reputation, then his reputation wasn't worth protecting. Margaret's face went red, but before she could respond, Jonah stepped forward, placing himself between Mara and the other woman. We're done here, he said quietly. Come on, Mara. They walked to their horses through a silence so complete that Mara could hear her own heartbeat. When they finally rode out of town, neither of them looked back. The week that followed was strange, suspended between relief and anxiety. Judge Harrison was true to his word, conducting a thorough investigation that involved interviewing half the town. The marshals found the location where the fires had been set and discovered traces of kerosene that shouldn't have been there, evidence that the fire was indeed deliberately started. Two of the men who'd been with Thomas Townsend that night broke under questioning and admitted their involvement, hoping for lighter sentences. By the end of the week, Harrison announced his findings at a public hearing in the courthouse, with most of Lincoln in attendance. After extensive investigation, he said, his voice carrying across the crowded room, I've determined that Thomas Townsend and 3 accomplices did deliberately set fire to the Cross Ranch with intent to intimidate and cause property damage. Furthermore, I've uncovered evidence of a coordinated campaign to drive Mr. and Mrs. Cross from the territory through social and economic pressure. This behavior constitutes criminal conspiracy and harassment. The room erupted in whispers, gasps, shouted protests. Harrison banged his gavel. Mr. Townsend will stand trial for arson and conspiracy. His 3 accomplices have agreed to testify in exchange for reduced sentences. Additionally, I'm levying fines against several businesses that participated in the economic boycott of Mrs. Cross, and I'm ordering the sheriff's office to provide adequate protection to the Cross family going forward. He looked directly at Sheriff Morrison, who was red-faced and sweating. If there are any further incidents of harassment or violence directed at them, I will consider it a failure of local law enforcement and will take steps to replace those who cannot maintain order impartially. Morrison looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. Harrison continued. Finally, I want to make something clear to everyone here. This territory was built by people who didn't fit comfortably into society's expectations. Outlaws and dreamers, widows and orphans, people looking for second chances and fresh starts. If we start deciding who's worthy of belonging based on narrow definitions of respectability, we betray everything the frontier is supposed to represent. He let that sit for a moment, then, Mr. and Mrs. Cross are residents of this territory with the same rights as anyone else. How you feel about their marriage is irrelevant. They will be afforded the same protections, the same access to services, and the same basic human dignity as every other citizen. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me. The room stayed quiet this time. though Mara could feel the resentment radiating from certain sections of the crowd. But there were others: Joseph Trent, a few of the younger townspeople, even Mr. Hartley from the general store, who were nodding, some looking ashamed. When the hearing ended, people filed out slowly, and Mara and Jonah were left standing in the courthouse with Joseph. "That went better than I hoped," Joseph said quietly. "Harrison didn't just rule in your favor. He made a statement. That takes courage." "Will it change anything?" Mara asked. "Or will people just hide their cruelty better?" "Some will, but some won't. You heard what he said. This territory was built by people who didn't fit. There are folks in this town who've been judged themselves, who know what it's like to be on the outside. They've been quiet because the Townsends and their friends set the tone. But now that tone's been challenged." Joseph smiled slightly. "Give it time. Things might surprise you." Over the next few months, things did surprise them. It started small. Mr. Hartley approached Mara the next time she came to town and apologized for refusing her service, then offered her a fair deal on supplies. The seamstress sent a note saying she'd be happy to make clothes for Ellie at a reduced rate by way of apology. People who'd crossed the street to avoid them began nodding and greeting, then stopping to make small talk about the weather or the cattle prices. Not everyone changed. Margaret Townsend and her close friends still glared when they passed, and there were families that wanted nothing to do with them. But the active hostility faded, replaced by a kind of wary acceptance that was, if not warm, at least bearable. Thomas Townsend was convicted and sentenced to 2 years in the territorial prison, along with fines that nearly bankrupted him. His bank was sold to new owners from Santa Fe, and Margaret left town to live with relatives back east. The shift in power dynamics was visible. Suddenly, the people who'd used social pressure as a weapon found themselves with less influence, and those who'd been quietly decent all along felt safer speaking up. Through it all, life on the ranch settled into something that felt almost normal. Jonah's hand healed completely. The burned pasture land was reseeded and began to show new growth. Ellie's carved horse was repaired so skillfully that you could barely see where it had broken, and she carried it everywhere, a talisman of resilience. And one evening in late spring, as Mara was working in the garden she'd planted behind the house, she looked up to find Jonah watching her from the porch with an expression she'd come to recognize. Soft, wondering, like he still couldn't quite believe she was real. "What?" she asked, brushing dirt from her hands. "Nothing, just happy." "Are you?" "Yeah." He came down the steps and crossed to where she stood among the young plants. "Yeah, I really am." Ellie came running from the barn where she'd been helping Cal with the horses, her face flushed with excitement. "Mama, Cal says I can help him ride fence tomorrow if it's all right with you." Mara glanced at Jonah, who nodded. "I think that would be fine, sweetheart. But you have to listen to Cal and do exactly what he says." "I will! I promise!" Ellie threw her arms around Mara's waist, then Jonah's legs, then ran back toward the barn to tell Cal the good news. Mara watched her go, this child who'd seen so much but somehow remained open and hopeful, and felt her throat tighten. "She's going to be all right," Jonah said quietly, reading her thoughts. "She's strong, like her mother. She's had to be too strong, too early. Maybe. But she's also learned that strength matters, that standing up for yourself matters, that love is worth fighting for." He took Mara's hand, dirt and all, and pulled her close. "Those aren't bad lessons." Mara leaned into him, breathing in the familiar smell of leather and horses and home. "When you first rode up to my cabin, did you ever imagine we'd end up here?" "Honestly, I didn't let myself imagine anything. I was too afraid of wanting something I couldn't have." He pressed his lips to her hair. "But here we are anyway." "Here we are," she echoed. That night, after Ellie was asleep and the ranch had gone quiet, Mara and Jonah sat on the porch under a sky so full of stars it looked like someone had spilled diamonds across black velvet. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of sage and new grass, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to the moon. "Do you ever think about the cabin?" Jonah asked. "About the life you had before?" Mara considered the question. "Sometimes, but not with regret. That life taught me how to survive alone. This life is teaching me how to live with someone else." "And which do you prefer?" She turned to look at him, this man who'd been broken and had chosen to heal anyway, who'd seen her when she was invisible to everyone else, who'd loved her daughter before he'd even admitted he loved her. "This one," she said, "every time this one." Jonah smiled, that rare, transformative thing that still made her breath catch, and pulled her against his side. They sat there in the peaceful dark, two people who'd been told they didn't deserve happiness and had claimed it anyway, and they let the night hold them. The years that followed weren't always easy. There were hard winters and dry summers, cattle that got sick, and fences that needed constant mending. There were people in town who never quite forgave them for disrupting the established order, who passed judgment in whispers and turned away in church. But there were also good years, years of plenty, years when the cattle were fat and the prices were high. There were new friends who came to the territory, people like them, who didn't quite fit anywhere else, and old wounds that slowly, incrementally healed. There were evenings on the porch with Ellie between them, growing taller and bolder with each passing season. There were mornings waking up beside Jonah and remembering each time with fresh wonder that this was her life now, that she'd been chosen, that she belonged. Ellie grew into a strong, capable young woman who could ride and rope as well as any ranch hand, who had her mother's resilience and her father's gentle strength. She never forgot what they'd endured, but she never let it make her bitter. Instead, she became someone who stood up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves, who saw the invisible ones and made sure they were seen. And when she was old enough to understand the full story of how her parents had come together, she said something that Mara carried in her heart forever after. "You taught me that being chosen is better than being accepted by people who don't matter. Thank you for that." On their 10th anniversary, Jonah took Mara back to the place where her cabin had stood. The structure was long gone, reclaimed by the prairie, but you could still see where the foundation had been. Grass grew thick there now, and wildflowers, purple asters and yellow rabbit brush, tough blooms that thrived in hard soil. "I wanted to show you something," Jonah said, helping her down from her horse. He led her to a flat stone he'd placed at the edge of where the cabin had been. On it, carved in his careful, deliberate hand, were words. Here, Mara Hale survived alone. Here she learned she was strong enough. Here she waited without knowing she was waiting. And here, her life began. Mara read the words 3 times, her vision blurring with tears before she could speak. "Jonah, I know you don't like to look back," he said quietly. "But I wanted to mark this place, not because of what was taken from you here, but because of what you built. You survived, Mara, and that survival brought you to me." She turned and wrapped her arms around him, pressing her face into his chest, and let herself cry, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming recognition of how far they'd come. From that desperate, lonely woman working her small plot of land to this, a woman with a family, a home, a man who loved her enough to carve her story in stone so she'd never forget what she was worth. "I love you," she said against his shirt. "I love you so much." "I love you too." His arms tightened around her. Every day, more than the day before. They stood there for a long time, 2 people carved from the same hard lessons, holding each other in the place where their story had begun. And when they finally rode back to the ranch, to the solid stone house, and the daughter who waited for them, and the life they'd fought so hard to claim, they rode together, side by side, casting a single shadow in the late afternoon sun. Behind them, wildflowers nodded in the breeze, and the prairie stretched endless and forgiving, holding their history like a promise kept. The quiet woman who'd been told she was forgettable had refused to be forgotten. The mountain of a man who'd thought he was finished had found a reason to begin again. And together, they'd built something that hate couldn't burn, that judgment couldn't diminish, that time would only strengthen. They'd built a home, not just a place, but a feeling, the knowledge that they belonged to each other, that they'd chosen each other, that they were enough. And in the end, that was everything. The prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying their story across the miles, and somewhere in Lincoln, a child who'd been told some people didn't deserve kindness heard it and decided to be kind anyway. Somewhere, a young couple looked at Mara and Jonah and thought maybe, just maybe, they could be brave too. Somewhere, the world shifted just a little, making room for people who didn't fit, for love that refused to hide, for the radical act of choosing each other despite everything. Mara Hale Cross, no longer plain, no longer forgettable, no longer alone, stood on her porch at sunset with her husband's hand in hers and her daughter laughing in the distance, and she thought, this is what winning looks like. Not dramatic or loud, but quiet and sure and real. Just this. Just love. Just enough. And under the wide New Mexico sky, as the last light painted everything gold, that was more than enough. That was everything.